Yeshua's call to radical discipleship, the call to give up everything to follow him, stands in stark contrast to the lack of rigor and structure in many evangelical churches. Our guest today, Bill Scofield of the Apocalyptic Gospel podcast, is here to talk about how the idea of discipleship, seen from a first century Jewish perspective, has shaped his ministry as a church planter in Redding, California.
Put your hand in mine together. We will walk in harmony. Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee.
You're listening to Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish and that changes everything. Messiah Podcast is a production of First Fruits of Zion. Well, some of you know him from the Apocalyptic Gospel podcast. He's been on here on Messiah Podcast before. And judging from some of the people I've met, some of you out there listening go to his congregation out in Redding, California. It's Bill Scofield. Welcome back to Messiah Podcast.
Hey, Jacob. Good to be on here. Good to be with you.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. So some of our listeners, and even some of us here on the staff, we're definitely fully immersed in the Apocalyptic Gospel podcast, which is on hiatus currently. And I'm sure that people are wondering, is there ever going to be a next? Would it be season 5? Is there going to be a reunion tour?
Yeah, season 5. I wouldn't rule it out that we don't have anything in the works, but you never know.
You never know.
Maybe we need the prompting of another apocalyptic sort of season like 2020 for season 5. I don't know, but
oh yeah,
we'll see.
We'll pray that we don't get an actual apocalypse. One of the prophets says, don't long for the day of the Lord because it's darkness and not light.
Yeah. Amos.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So I've met several people who have gone to your congregation in Redding, which statistically is highly unlikely. So I thought it was more funny to me every time I met someone who was like, "Oh yeah, I've been out to Bill Scofield's congregation." It was like,
that's funny. Okay.
So I wanted to ask, what are you doing out there in Redding? The worship music eggheads out there will know that your church isn't the only one in Redding.
Right. That's right.
Because Bethel is out there. So
yeah.
What makes your congregation different? Like, what was the need that you saw to where you're like, you know what, we need a congregation here in Redding?
Discipleship. That was basically it. So we actually started the congregation with a vision to train house church planters. I have a missions background, so I was a missionary's kid. And so, it was after kind of having the gospel reworked for a number of years, and really the most logical expression of the gospel seemed to be to me to like, let's plant simple, doesn't have to be in a home, but simple fellowships and train leaders and give them confidence in the message, and then but create an environment that's simple enough to facilitate good discipleship and leadership training. So that's what we tried to do.
I feel like it would be remiss not to point out the contrast with Bethel and some of the other some of churches I've visited and enjoyed. North Point is the big boys whose services are far from simple. Having a little bit of knowledge about service programming myself.
Yeah.
Were you consciously sort of pushing the pendulum away from that model and thinking, can we do something that fulfills a different niche, a different role?
So yeah, that's a challenge trying to, so there were times at the beginning when that was a thought, and then I did my best. We did our best as a team here. I wasn't alone. My wife especially, but also others on the team, to basically focus on just being pragmatic. So discipleship isn't working from a big stage. It's just not.
Right.
So how do we facilitate discipleship happening? And relationships are obviously a big part of that. What about on a day when we meet? We tried meeting all sorts of days of the week because, Sunday's not necessarily when you have to meet. And ultimately Sunday is when everybody had already set aside time that was free to be able to meet. So we ended up back on Sundays, but we kind of arranged the community in a way that facilitates discipleship and relationships to be more organic but intentional. And then even our group, as it grows, it becomes more awkward. But we started with a small group meeting in like a circle. We try to recreate, even though when we had to rent a building because I have 7 children of my own. We have other people that have 5 and 6 children. And so we have a number of larger families. So we said, okay, let's rent a building because we need to do that. But let's still try to keep the kind of environment where everyone is invited to participate. Learning happens deeper through participation. So we kind of arrange the room in a big circle and definitely invite participation and questions. And even at certain times, I love to hear your observations about the text and things like that. It just seems to facilitate, that alone seems to facilitate a lot more ownership and a lot more ownership of their own discipleship versus it's the clergy's job to disciple me. Yeah. Like I have a big role to play in being a disciple. And so I that was kind of the objective. We wanted to do that. And then hopefully the community life is kind of an overflow of what the meeting looks like. Okay. So this seems to be like sort of the emphasis of your ministry is discipleship. Is that something that you've had a passion for like the whole time you've been a disciple, or is it something that sort of one day was a realization like, okay, this is actually what I need to be focusing on? Yeah, no, it was, I'd say it was definitely there from the beginning. I remember being 16 and feeling a real burden to disciple my brother's 13-year-old friends. Wow. For sure. That's fantastic. Yeah. I feel like it is kind of trendy, like the word disciple. And I went out on Google Trends to look, and the word disciple since COVID, the word disciple, searches for the word disciple are higher. Not like, interesting. Not like a big, well, there is one big spike, but, like the average just goes up. So I think people are thinking about it more. I was talking to my buddy from high school recently, and he dropped the word Talmud in a conversation. Interesting. Which is the Hebrew word for disciple. And that was, I didn't expect that. So I think, anecdotally even, it seems like people are becoming more aware, that discipleship's important. So what I'll ask you is, and this is something maybe that we teach about and that I'm sure some of our listeners will know about, but what's the difference between maybe the average churchgoer's idea of what a disciple is versus like the first century Jewish idea, like what we would find in the New Testament? We see the word in the New Testament. Like, what does it actually mean there? Wow. Yeah. There's a big disciple. We generally think of somebody who's being mentored, which there's a little bit of correlation with that. Somebody who's being more intentionally mentored. Sometimes people use disciple as interchangeable with Christian. And, right. but it essentially like, I try to establish pretty early in relationships, whether it's people trying to come to participate in our group, or maybe just meeting with someone individually, like try to establish pretty early, like the value of that word over, for example, the word Christian is that the Christian means nothing, especially now. You can't nail a meaning to it. If we got in our big room full of people in a circle and I asked everyone to go around and tell me what a Christian was, you'd have, 20, 30 different answers, and you couldn't criticize any of them. Right? There's nothing concrete about it. Whereas a disciple in the first century was a very concrete thing. Everybody knew what it was. Every significant rabbi had disciples. And, Some were in John, they called themselves disciples of Moses. There were disciples of John, disciples of Jesus, disciples of the Pharisees. So they all had disciples, and essentially a disciple was somebody who was basically committed to learning the rabbi's. In a lot of contexts, it was this rabbi's particular framework for the law and the prophets. Mm-hmm. And we can think of Hillel and Shammai here. Yeah. And secondly, a real practical emphasis on it. Kind of one of the commitments was a practical emphasis on learning to not just understand the information the rabbi had, but learning to become like the rabbi.
Yeah.
Like this was a big deal. And Jesus used that language all the time. Luke 6 says, Jesus uses the language, says it's enough. Like it's appropriate for a disciple or a student to just become like their master. Like that's the objective.
Oh yeah.
And he said later, but some of you are saying, Lord, Lord, and not doing what I say. How is that?
Yeah.
And so essentially, with that in mind, I thought, man, understanding that becoming a disciple assumes a commitment to not only follow and learn from the rabbi, but to become like him, to allow for that process that he initiates for you to actually become like he is. And so that's basically how we emphasize discipleship here. It's just learning to obey Jesus and learning to become like him.
Yeah.
That sounds maybe oversimplified, but if you break it down, I think it's actually been really fruitful.
Yeah. Well, and that's what it was. It was sort of learning through imitation was a big part of it. And I think for me growing up, I would have confused the word discipleship with maybe education or even like spiritual formation. Right. And while those are components, there is this more specific idea in Judaism that I think we should all be aware of.
Yeah,
it's important. So you're going to be speaking at one of our events. We have an event coming up. Hopefully, this will be evergreen content. But for those of you listening, as we put these out, Tzadi Advance is coming up. It's for young adults. It's for 18 to 35-year-olds. It's coming on January 2nd, 2025. And you're speaking there. And I have your outlines. And the theme is discipleship. I don't know if that came first and then we picked you, or if we wanted you to come speak and decided discipleship was a good idea. I think maybe some of both. I mean, because it's a big deal for us too. But I have your notes, and I wanted to ask you some specific questions to sort of to whet people's appetite. Maybe someone out there is thinking about attending, or they're already attending, and we want them to be excited about what they're going to hear. So my first question from your outline, you talk about the parable of the two foundations, and everyone's heard this. Everyone's out there listening has heard this. The wise man builds his house on the rock, and the foolish man builds his house on the sand. And I remember singing about this in Sunday school, and the rains come and wash away the house of the foolish man. Yeah. And I think a lot of Christians, maybe not consciously, maybe they wouldn't explain it this way, but in their heart, they feel this idea that if you do what Jesus says, which is a leg up to a lot of Christians who don't actually think you need to do what Jesus says, but if you do what Jesus says, then you'll be protected from like hurricanes or something. Like they take it really literally. Like you won't have a financial disaster in your life or something like that. Whereas when you come away with that parable with a very different take, can you tell us how you explain the two foundations parable?
Yeah. Often if I'm meeting with a new disciple, especially one that has no background in Christianity, which is always pretty fun. The emphasis is I actually begin with the foundations of the two parable, or the parable of the two foundations. Yeah, because I think it's extremely easy to understand unless you really have to try to misunderstand it. It seems like, although I did before, but one of the things that's really helpful for me was was just looking at the imagery that Jesus evokes is really helpful. The foundation, the house. So this is like, terms that are familiar from the wisdom literature. And it had to do with, someone actually continuing on, not just having a home that maybe, oh no, we got to call the insurance company, is actually like their life continuing on, their family continuing on was the status of their quote unquote house. So that was helpful. And then secondly, early 5th century, Augustine wrote a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. And Augustine commented very famously that these represented what has now become so commonplace, that Jesus was referring to the common storms of life to every man.
Yeah.
And this is so the various interpretations. Yeah. So you won't suffer total ruin when the storms of life come. And, the emphasis on how protected you'll be varies from group to group. But Jesus is actually borrowing imagery from the prophets and from Second Temple literature that is really prominent throughout Ezekiel. Isaiah uses it a number of times. Even the Proverbs uses the imagery. So the storms, the hurricane, the winds, the floods throughout the prophets, and again, other Second Temple, Second Baruch, 3rd Enoch, sibling oracles, they use that same language to describe, it's an image to describe the day of judgment, or often it's the great time of difficulty before the Mashiach comes.
Oh, yeah.
And so, in other words, the idea that Jesus is communicating is rather radical, but I think he backs it up with a lot of his other teachings. It's that there's a kind of a double value to obeying his teachings. One, they essentially frame righteousness from the heart. They essentially, for the contemporary Jew with Jesus, they essentially frame, how do we, in a complicated season, because they were in a very complicated time in Judaism at the time, and lots of complications. And so Jesus essentially frames, this is how we serve God with the Torah while keeping a pure and sincere heart before God. And so in other words, lots of rabbis at the time were, as the saying goes, were building a fence around the Torah. And Jesus' emphasis of building a fence had to do with sincerity of the heart. That's the way you build a fence around the Torah, in order to ensure that you prioritize keeping the Torah, not doing away with the Torah, obviously. So, and in this context, Jesus says they do have the value that you are acting righteously. But secondly, it has a secondary value in that my teachings are actually preparatory to prepare and strengthen disciples for the future. Which became a real emphasis later on with the apostles. I think about James famously starts off, and he says, "My brothers, count it all joy when you find yourself in various trials, because the testing of your faith produces endurance." And it's like and so like if you read it, like casually think, okay, yeah, I need to just make it through this. But James' rationale is you need to make it through this intentionally, letting these things have their full work of humbling you before God, because greater things are coming and you need more endurance than you have right now. And this was kind of a framework that the apostles all operated with. And so I think that I see in the parable of the two foundations, Jesus essentially highlighting this mechanism that obeying me has a way of preparing you internally for trials coming in the future that you're not currently prepared to face.
Yeah. That's a good way to think about it. And yeah, like the apostles did anticipate that. I mean, they were thinking the apocalypse is here, or it's coming very soon, and so that's always been the case. I mean, it's always been sort of on the doorstep in a way.
Yeah.
coming from a relatively prosperous society where, like you said, with insurance, a lot of us have been able to shield ourselves from some of the things, that previous generations was normal for previous generations.
Right.
So
that's created a sense of delusion in us that it's always going to be that way.
Yeah,
that's why
it's not.
Yeah, the wisdom from God is like so precious right now.
Yeah, well, because I think about the people and even our systems and the way that we live life and get food and all of that. There's a lot of brittleness there. There's not a lot of endurance. There's not a lot of capacity to absorb various kinds of impacts.
Yeah, true.
And I think that's true probably in the spiritual realm too.
Yeah.
Like when it gets tough, and like you said, Christian's not just an identity that you have, but it's something that's more than that.
Yeah.
That's going to be what like carries you.
Yeah. And it feels to me like Jesus in laying out the things that he did, he's just such a wise and caring shepherd, because if you think about it, all leadership, in a sense, all leaders are called upon to be prophetic in a sense. I remember reading recently that, in Jewish tradition, in some Jewish tradition, all parents are endowed with a momentary gift of prophecy when they're naming their children.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that all leadership is an effort to prepare the person you're leading for some scenario in the future. Like all leadership has to do that. Yeah. And so the wisdom and really I think the tenderness of the leadership of Jesus to look at people, to know with certainty where things are going and to prepare them for that is one of the coolest things about kind of discovering the Jewishness of Jesus, is because then all of his sayings, they unfold and you realize, wow, he is a wise shepherd, really is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's real. It's not just here's some good advice, and it's
right. Yeah,
and it's not here's an ideal world that you'll never have until I come back, but it's
right. Exactly.
Here's how you can be ready.
Yeah.
Love it. All right. So my next question, you have in your notes this idea that we assume, and I don't know whether this is like Platonic or sort of but it's this idea that love leads to obedience. So you work really hard and you cultivate love for God, and then born out of that love, you'll obey. And that's not, I don't think that's incorrect, but you also say that, look, sometimes it goes the other way. You obey, and then born out of that obedience, you find that your love grows.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I actually think that's one of the more misunderstood parts of discipleship. There's a wonderful book called The Love of God by an author named John Levinson. He's a Jewish man. I don't know if he still holds the position, but he was the director of the School of Divinity in Harvard.
Oh, wow.
So John wrote this book called The Love of God and basically explained what the love of God is from a Jewish perspective in terms of both the Tanakh and Jewish tradition. And so he says, one of the things he said is that it's common to look at love as, like in post-Enlightenment world, we see, we have our issues that we're kind of working through because in light of humanism in the post-Enlightenment world, what happened is people think about love in terms of the heart, and the heart is essentially the source of all good. And I just have to uncover it, and I have to liberate it from the externals that are unnecessary. In his book, one of the things he highlights, he says in Jewish tradition, love is sort of a reciprocal relationship with obedience. And he highlights one story that really was provoking to me. He highlighted a story in Jewish tradition that's commenting on a passage in Jeremiah. And the passage, you'd skip over this if it wasn't for the commentary. It says, because you have turned away from me and you have stopped keeping my Torah. You're like, okay, you just pass on, they're being bad. You're right.
Yeah.
But the rabbis lingered and said, the reason the rabbis did this often is they would say, the reason he said two different things, you've forsaken me and you've left my Torah, is because what he's saying is, that even if you had forsaken me, you would have kept keeping my Torah. And that just sounds so backwards, right? You've forsaken God, but you're still going to keep the Torah. But the commentary then says, because obedience to the Torah is the starter dough that leads to a heart that loves obedience.
Oh, yeah.
Whoa, that's true. There is a reciprocal relationship with obedience and love. And so that led me to start exploring like some of the teachings of Jesus, like in Matthew 6 and his teachings on dealing with finances and generosity, for example. One of the interesting things he says is, don't store up for yourselves treasures here, and he's talking about giving, being generous, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And the reason is because where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So the mechanism is that I commit to, and so I live in the way that Jesus is instructing. And what it does is it actually causes my heart to love not heaven, but love the coming of the Messiah when his reward comes with him. And so I can feel indifferent today about the Messiah and about his coming because things are just going so great. But if you have stored up a reward there that's greater than this one, it will cause your heart to love his coming. Yeah. It's like, wow, that is really interesting. And so I think that thinking actually goes throughout the teachings of Yeshua. And I found it in a number of places. And I go, this actually helps significantly because it helps me understand sometimes when you get into those fickle patterns and you go through the ups and downs, and the wisdom of staying steady in the ups and downs is not just because it's going to be a downer your whole life and you just got to learn how to, because I think the Lord knows that emotions are intended to motivate. And even if we're not always on a mountaintop experience in terms of our emotions, as we learn to stay steady as disciples, following and obeying Jesus, the Lord knows that will actually stir up love in our hearts for the things that God cares about. Much like if you know anyone who's highly invested in Bitcoin, right now they're really, really watching the market because they got a lot in it and it just hit like a record high, didn't it, recently? And so if you have a lot invested, because essentially Jesus' teachings, living that way, whether you're, giving up reputation or money or retribution or whatever it is you're giving up, you got a lot coming when the Messiah comes. Yeah. And so it causes your heart to love his coming and to love the things that he cares about more. So that's kind of where those notes are aimed right there.
That makes perfect sense. You have this idea, you quote this verse, continue in the grace of God. Continue in the grace of God, which is, I think, like you talked about the Jeremiah verse, is one of those verses that you just read over. It's like, don't stop going to church or whatever, like whatever idea comes into your head when you read that. But, you stop to think about it and it's like, I thought, isn't grace something that you just get for free? Like, how do you resubscribe to grace? How do you continue getting, is there an option to not get the grace anymore or to unget it? So, Is there something we should be doing, or does this have some bearing on like the old argument of if you're saved once, are you saved forever, and all of that? Like, is that the waters into which you're dipping your toes for this idea, or?
I'm not. I mean, I definitely have a stance on that. I don't think that this sort of static kind of relationship really makes much sense in light of, especially in light of first century Jewish reading of the scriptures. But one of the reasons I highlight the word grace there is because I don't know how long it was, 7, 8 years ago, I came across a book and some lectures and then started reading several articles. And one of the things I found out is that it's the word charis is a really, really significant word in the Greco-Roman world, which makes a lot of sense why Paul is using it. Seneca, a Roman thinker from just after the time of Paul, wrote that charis is the foundation for Greco-Roman civilization.
Really?
He's a pagan.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking, whoa, so Paul is writing to somebody who knows very well what this is, right? And so through reading and study, find out that essentially charis was a word used to describe what was a relationship between a patron or a wealthy person and a client or a benefactor.
Okay.
And essentially that relationship was governed by charis. And so charis was one, it was sometimes used to describe the emotion, like the feeling that the patron had, the powerful person had towards the people, the person in the lower state.
Okay.
And if he felt like I really wanted to do a favor for this guy, it was known as charis. And then when he would actually give that, act on that feeling, it was also called charis. It's where we get the word charisma. The word ma is often like that extension on a word to make it into to make it into a different noun, essentially is an extension or the result of the first noun. So the result of grace is charisma. And so God gave grace as a response to that feeling of favor he had towards someone. But Seneca went on to write, the reason this is so vital is because that relationship was not intended to be a one-time relationship. Like we might think of, if we have a hard time financially, we might go, man, I'm going to have to go take out a loan to get through this season. So you go to the bank, and then when it's paid off, your relationship with the bank is over. Yeah. And he said, and Seneca writes, God forbid we should think of this relationship that way. He said, the only reason why a benefactor cuts off a potential recipient of grace is because he's an unworthy recipient. So again, this is a pagan writer, and he begins to elaborate on the appropriate response. And he said, the recipient of grace from a patron ought to, one, live his life in a way that's honorable to the patron. He ought to make known the glories of the patron around society. He ought to make his name great in that society.
Wow.
And he ought to treat others in a way that's honoring to the patron. And he says, if he fails to do that, he becomes a dishonorable person, and he is unworthy, and that relationship of him receiving grace will be severed, and he won't ever receive grace again. And as I'm studying this, I'm just going, oh my gosh, Paul finally makes a little bit more sense here.
Yeah.
Like, especially because he's invoking such a highly significant term in the Greco-Roman world. And so when that exhortation comes from Hebrews, but that we should continue on in the grace of God, makes a lot of sense in that context. And so essentially, it's just going to frame, what I'm hoping to do during my time there is to frame our relationship with God as something that God sees us favorably. I mean, he definitely, it's like he says, like Jesus said to his disciples, guys, don't worry. It's the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Like, that's God's plan for you. You don't have to worry about that. But at the same time, there's a stewarding the grace of God that we get in a way that's honoring to God. And if not, that's a big deal. And that is really largely neglected in the Christian conversation. And I think that is one of the reasons why shipwreck in the faith is becoming so common, is because the gift of God is not something that needs to be stewarded any longer. It just needs to be appreciated and and we need to, in some context, make sure that we don't try to reciprocate or act in a way that is honoring to God in response to that. And so I think that leads to a big, big problem in complicated seasons of life. And so especially for people in this age demographic, I think just a simple understanding when you open up Paul and you go, oh, that's right. Like reading that God has acted favorably towards you ought to elicit, I'm so thankful, but also that's sober. That means I have some, I want to maintain that relationship with God. I want to steward the grace that he's given and not act in response in a way that's dishonorable to him. So that's kind of trying to place disciples on a foundation like that is kind of the objective.
Yeah. I like the contrast there between stewardship and appreciation. It's the stewardship is a lot more active, and I think you're right. I mean, when I listen to evangelical pastors, I'll go out and listen to sermons and stuff, and because I still swim in those waters. You can hear when a pastor feels like he got too close to saying you have to do something.
Right, totally.
He'll sort of walk it back.
Big
like,
back
we don't really have to.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's true. I have a friend who's a missionary in Milan, and he's been overseas for years, and he calls the Western Church the Jesus Appreciation Club. And I just can't get over how great that is. Yeah,
there's a lot of truth to that. It's I wrote an article about that recently and just said, without the rigor and structure, like I think evangelicalism is doomed because it's just going to come apart at the seams. And you can see it happening every week. Yeah,
you almost don't have to be prophetic to say that because it's right in front of your eyes.
Yeah. So I think it'll be interesting to see if, as a broader movement, whether that's some error correcting can be done, or whether from the ashes something new will be born.
Right.
It's hard to tell. All right, so here's my last question.
Yeah,
and I like this one a lot because I've thought about this too. So we have Jesus telling people, and this is from Luke 14. He has people. He's setting this bar really, really high, where he says, "Look, if you can't give up everything you have, right? If you don't despise your family, we have language like this in different places in the Gospels, then you can't be my disciple." And of course, growing up, in English we have this. We don't respect the distinction between may not and cannot, right? And so we think what he's saying is like, look, you can't. I'm not going to print out and laminate your discipleship membership card unless you can bring me the receipt that you've donated everything you have. You know what I mean? Like it's the barrier to entry, and I won't allow you to become my disciple unless you can show the receipts. But you in your lecture notes, you have a different approach to that. It's what he's saying is something different from that. You want to expand on that idea?
Yeah. So it's almost like the bookends to the sessions there. So the two foundations highlighting that that obedience to Jesus essentially does an inward work that actually strengthens us to be able to endure the future, the trials to come. And here, essentially, Jesus is saying the same thing. But again, the grammar, it's because it's a correct translation technically. But the distinction is so lost to the average American. The way that we communicate, can and may I are very different. So to give you an idea for this word, so may I means permission. So Jesus would be saying, if that's what he was saying, is that unless you do that, like you just highlighted with that illustration, I won't authorize you to be my disciple.
Right, exactly.
But that's not what that word means in Greek at all. And it's, like I said, it's technically translated correctly. We read it casually. We don't think about proper grammar. And so the word there, it's the verbal form of the word in Acts 1, where Jesus says, he uses the noun form, you will receive dunamis when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. This is just the verbal form of that word. It means ability. It means power or ability. And so what Yeshua is saying is, he says, if you don't renounce like your allegiance to like family structures, because ultimately family structures, very different from now, that was a mechanism for passing on inheritance, right? And so it wasn't a commitment to your family, it's a commitment to yourself, right? That's not what he's addressing. And so, and then he talks about, foregoing all your possessions, not loving your own life. And then what he warns is you're not going to have the power or the ability to continue as my disciple if you don't do these things. The passage begins where he looks back and he sees a huge multitude following him. And so he goes, guys, I appreciate the sincerity, but I have to warn you from the onset that in order to continue with me until the end, it's going to be really costly. Like you're going to have to, the obedience is the thing that is actually working longevity and perseverance in you. If you're not willing to forego everything and follow my lead, follow my example, again, becoming like the master, then guys, regretfully, you won't have the ability. He goes, in fact, you'll be like, imagine somebody who, here in probably everywhere, but when there's going to be a big construction site, they put up fences around and they put who the architect is and who the construction company is. And they put a drafter's vision of what the building's going to look like. And there's a lot of hoopla to explain the mess that's going on. And imagine, and Jesus is like, so imagine that happens. And then the guy runs out of money because he didn't actually know how much it was going to cost to finish the building. Imagine how humiliating that would be. And he goes, that's what you guys will be if you keep following me because I do miracles and sometimes I give food to people miraculously. If you keep following me because of that, you're not going to finish. So I'm trying to, again, compassionately warn you from the onset. It's going to be costly for the things that are in you that would ultimately lead to you turning away, for those to be dealt with. It's going to take you renouncing this life, favoring the next life. And if you do that, God will supply to you abundant strength to finish the race. But if you don't, you won't have it.
Yeah.
So essentially, that's what I think Jesus is saying in Luke 14.
Yeah, so true. I mean, every generation, is staring down the barrel of the apocalypse. It could happen at any time. And I've lived a privileged life. I have everything I need. I don't know what it's like to be afraid of hunger,
Right. It's true. Yeah.
And so it's that message. It was hard to accept then, even for a generation that sort of knew what he was talking about. They knew what famine was, right? And just for me, I think, do I really get that? Like, do I really understand how bad it could become? Because, God forbid, but the apocalypse could happen tomorrow.
Yeah. Right. And I think if you go back to the prophets, so there's kind of a criticism towards the apostles. And so it kind of, the academic world splits on how they will view that, because conservatives are really skeptical and really hesitant to accept that the apostles really thought the Messiah was coming back in their lifetime. But they essentially communicate it all over the place. Paul says it all over the place. Those of us who are alive and remain, will be caught up in the air. And he thinks he's going to be there, until the end. And so people have a hard time because they think that misjudging that is somehow a criticism on the rest of the content of the apostles' teachings. But number one, that's how all the prophets lived. All the prophets were not given a timeline. And even if you say, well, there was a partial fulfillment in their day, and then there was the day of the Lord long term, which I don't think is exactly accurate. But even if you want to say that, still, most of the prophecies given by the prophets to their contemporaries, the actual judgment that was foretold didn't take place for an entire lifetime. So his audience still experienced it completely pressed off into the enigmatic future. And yet they were told to repent now as though it were happening right then. And so this has always been God's way. And just when the apostles, in Acts 1, get the 40 days about the kingdom of God, everything is finally set straight. Okay, we get it. The big question is it at this time? You're going to do this. You're going to regather the exiles and establish the kingdom. And Jesus basically says, I'm not telling. And the reason, he says, it's not for you guys to know. And the reason is because if we knew, we would live in a way that was dishonoring to God, because he knows that. Mm-hmm. Urgency is our friend. Complacency is not. So you highlighted it. These are challenging messages for Westerners, and it is what it is. But I think to be faithful shepherds, we have to acknowledge that, and not just say it, but really try to help people walk through that. I heard a Jewish thinker, a Jewish historian, talking about on a Jewish podcast on, I think it was the Tikva Fund podcast. Okay. I heard him observing. He said, he's not messianic, right? He's a Jewish. He said, we have to acknowledge that, our greatest allies in the world as Jews are Christians. Right now they are. And he goes, so I've studied Christian culture for a long time because of this dynamic. And he goes, there's an interesting thing that happens. He goes, when Christianity goes in and embeds itself into a culture, the result is always peace, security, and prosperity. He goes, and yet the things that make Christianity exceptional, their followers following the teachings of Jesus, they don't thrive in that environment. And so interestingly, the peace and prosperity and security created by Christianity ultimately leads to having followers of Jesus that don't excel at following Jesus. Yeah. And he goes, and that creates a big moral vacuum. And that's where the Jews often get in trouble, is in the vacuum in the wake of Christian culture. And I thought, wow, what an insight. But I think we all feel that, like in times when everything's going well, it takes such intentionality to live as though the next age is way more valuable than this age. It takes a lot of intentionality, and it takes a lot of conviction. And so, God willing, the Spirit will move here during our time and impart a lot of that conviction to some of the young people. That's really my hope. Yeah, absolutely. And the call to radical discipleship as someone who's almost 40, to those at the tender age of 18 to 35. I mean, because those are formative years. It's not just, high school is not the only formative years. These are formative years, and right, for sure. A lot of people drop out of their faith during those years, and for people to know what the stakes are at that time is important, because then there's time to change and adjust and begin living that life. Yeah, amen. All right, well, Tzadi Advance, again, it's our event for singles. There's some couples that are coming, but it's mostly for singles. It's for 18 to 35-year-olds, January 2nd through the 6th, 2025. You can sign up at ffoz.org. And this has been Bill Scofield. He's speaking at the event. He's going to go into more detail on all this stuff, and you're going to meet somebody special. I guess I can't promise that, but the environment will be conducive. The environment will be conducive. If you don't meet somebody special, it might be your own fault. We're going to do the best we can. But thanks for joining us on Messiah Podcast, Bill Scofield. Yeah, great to be with you again, Jacob. Thanks for joining us today on Messiah Podcast. If you're interested in learning more about the Jewish Jesus, check out First Fruits of Zion at ffoz.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. Messiah Podcast is made possible by the generosity of our First Fruits of Zion friends. FFOZ friends are people like you who support our mission and get loads of exclusive Bible commentary, teaching, and content. You can join today at ffoz.org. Tune in next time for more great conversations. Until then, I'm Jacob Franzak. Shalom.
like the waters cover the sea.